Charles Walker had always been a dignified man, with a quiet strength earned from years of perseverance in a world that too often mistreated him. On that fateful flight, however, dignity was stripped away in a way that no one, especially not someone with his years of hard-earned experience, could have ever imagined. There he was, confidently boarding Flight 716, dressed in a sharp navy wool suit and polished dark Oxford shoes, carrying a silver watch that caught the light with every precise adjustment of his cuff. As he passed by the immaculate flight attendant near the galley, that attendant, Rebecca Summers, known for her perfectly pressed uniform and unsmiling gaze, had something in her eyes that day, a silent judgment that would mark the beginning of an ordeal that threatened to undo Charles in front of every passenger. It all began when Charles was wrongfully forced out of his first-class seat. In a scene witnessed by every person aboard, he was accused of stealing a Cartier watch, a watch that had never even been his to begin with. There was no evidence, no theft. It was simply a pretext to humiliate him publicly because of the color of his skin, while other passengers remained indifferent, some furtively recording the shocking spectacle on their smartphones. The cold efficiency of the security officers left no room for mercy as they dragged him out. A mere glance from Rebecca and hushed whispers amongst the crew had sealed his fate. In those first few moments, the injustice was unmistakable. An act of discrimination disguised under the guise of standard protocol, yet fueled by racial prejudice that no amount of formal procedures could ever justify. Charles knew all too well how the world could be cruel. He had spent a lifetime working twice as hard for half the reward, yet standing tall in the face of adversity. His presence on that flight was one of quiet confidence, a testament to his resilience and a silent challenge to the arrogance that pervaded those charged with maintaining order. And on that day, the disdain of the crew transformed into something far more sinister, something that would ignite a blaze of retribution in the days to come. He remembered each subtle microaggression as Rebecca's eyes lingered a fraction too long, conveying a verdict already passed, a verdict that declared him guilty by nothing more than the virtue of his dark skin. When Charles had settled into his assigned seat 2A, carefully stowing his briefcase in the overhead compartment, he had hoped for a quiet journey, but even as he opened his tablet, the polite facade that had often characterized the routine of air travel was shattered. Rebecca's voice, crisp and controlled, summoned him to check his boarding pass. While her tone initially appeared to be strict professionalism, it was laced with a condescension that chilled him. Her mechanical response as she returned his pass, the brief nod that barely concealed her disdain, only foreshadowed the events that were about to unfold. Within minutes, the cabin's calm was disrupted by a frantic outcry from a woman in seat 2C. "My watch!" she exclaimed, her hand trembling as if in genuine panic. "It was right here, and now it's gone!" The watch in question was no ordinary timepiece. It was a cherished Cartier, a symbol of her status and her style. Rebecca rushed over with a practiced air of concern, her expression smooth and her words meticulously measured. "We will get to the bottom of this," she reassured her, all the while her eyes darting unsettlingly toward Charles, as if he might hold the secret to the missing item. Without pausing to question the inconsistency of her actions, why she was focusing solely on him despite there being other passengers, the tension in the cramped confines of the aircraft soared. "Sir, would you mind standing up for a moment?" she requested, her tone betraying no hint of the underlying accusation. Yet when Charles rose, he sensed that something was amiss. "Why am I the only one asked to stand?" he inquired softly, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning within. Rebecca's explanation came too hastily, a feeble excuse about protocol that offered little comfort. "Because I am the only black man in 1C, she finally declared, the words hanging in the air like a verdict. The revelation rippled through the cabin, drawing disapproving murmurs from passengers who had once believed in the fairness of procedures but were now forced to confront the blatant racism unfolding before them. As the search for the missing watch unfolded, Rebecca's manner grew increasingly insidious. Every action she took, from glancing suspiciously at Charles to her whispered communications with the other crew members, seemed designed to compound his humiliation. A fellow attendant, Melissa, a young woman clearly uncomfortable with her role in this disgrace, could only watch as Rebecca's cold gaze never wavered from Charles. The confrontation escalated when Rebecca threatened to involve the captain if Charles did not comply with her increasingly farcical demands. In that moment, the familiar routine of air travel had transformed into a spectacle of racial prejudice and cruelty. A spectacle that would leave a scar in the memory of every passenger present. Charles's calm defiance in the midst of such injustice was nothing short of heroic. In a powerful display of quiet anger and unwavering resolve, he spoke with measured clarity. "Please do," he said when the security officer suggested that a confrontation would be inevitable. With each step he took down the aisle, escorted by security personnel who seemed themselves torn by conflicting loyalties, Charles's presence underscored the bitter irony of the moment. Here was a man whose life had been defined by his strength and dignity, now forced to endure public scrutiny and unchecked humiliation. Every gaze bore into him, not with empathy, but with the quiet complicity of bystanders who had grown accustomed to injustice. As the row of first-class seats became a silent jury, Charles proceeded to the aisle where an officer, whose voice carried the weight of reluctant authority, instructed him to leave the plane for further questioning. In that moment, every detail, from the hesitant recording on smartphones to the furtive glances exchanged between passengers, served as a stark reminder that in a world rife with injustice, acts of prejudice could still occur, even in the most polished environments. Accusations were leveled without evidence, and decisions were made not on the basis of truth, but on the basis of skin color. The situation reached a boiling point when Charles was forced to step out with his carry-on, under the unyielding stare of Rebecca, whose icy demeanor had only deepened since the initial incident. Along the way, a nearby passenger mocked him in a tone that was both casual and cutting, questioning why a man with nothing to hide would protest the procedures he was being forced to endure. "I've been cooperating my whole life," Charles replied, his voice laced with both sadness and fury. His quiet declaration resonated through the aisle. A statement of a lifetime spent under the weight of systemic prejudice and misplaced suspicion. As the officers conducted a cursory search of his belongings, opening his carefully packed carry-on in full view of an audience whose expressions ranged from shock to disdain, the cruel irony was palpable. Each item in his bag, his neatly folded blazer, a laptop, a binder marked confidential, and even a child's hand-drawn picture that showed him holding hands with a small girl, spoke of a life built on hope, dedication, and the unbreakable bonds of love. The sight of that fragile drawing, accompanied by a note that read, "Good luck, Daddy, you're the bravest man I know, love, Jada," only deepened the sense of injustice felt by those who witnessed the ordeal. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to make his suffering all the more poignant. Every personal memento a silent testament to the trials he had endured, and every discarded paper a reminder of the deep scars left by a lifetime of discrimination. And yet, even in the face of such overwhelming despair, Charles' spirit remained unbroken. When the lead officer finally declared that nothing was amiss with his belongings, there was no trace of the missing Cartier. Charles's tone was clipped with determination. "Of course there's nothing here," he remarked, his gaze locking onto Rebecca with an intensity that belied his measured calm. There was never anything to find. The quiet power of his words resonated with every witness, serving as an unspoken rebuke to those who would dare to judge him solely on the basis of his skin color. It was at that moment that Charles decided he would no longer endure the humiliation in silence. Pulling out his phone, he made a decisive call. "Carl, it's Charles," he said in a voice that dropped an octave, calm yet resolute. "I need aviation legal to flag a developing situation on flight 716 in first class. I want a record pulled on crew assignments and passenger interactions from the last 2 hours. Start internal. With that single call, he set in motion a chain of events that promised to bring the full force of accountability down on those who had so callously abused their power. In that brief pause, as he locked eyes with Rebecca, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, witnessing not just an act of defiance, but the birth of a long overdue reckoning. Throughout the next few agonizing minutes, the tension aboard the flight became palpable. The door remained open and the boarding process was suspended as the atmosphere thickened with uncertainty. While some passengers nodded in quiet solidarity, others kept their distance, unwilling to become embroiled in the drama that unfolded like a live, uninvited broadcast. Even the young woman who had recorded the entire episode with an air of rebellious defiance now offered a discreet nod of sympathy as she acknowledged the bravery of a man standing up against injustice. Yet, as if the incident could not unravel further, a voice from 2 rows back cut through the oppressive silence. "Are we going to take off today, or is this still amateur hour?" The remark, delivered by a man whose tone blended insolence with an undercurrent of approval for the spectacle, was the final straw. His presence and his challenge underscored the reality that for many on board, this farce was as much about entertainment as it was about prejudice. As he made his way toward Charles's row and leaned in to address him, a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity spread among the gathered passengers. "Mr. Walker," he said in a low, menacing rumble, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Charles, though battered by humiliation, did not retreat. Instead, he met the challenge with a calm that bordered on stoic defiance. "On what grounds?" he inquired, his voice smooth yet resolute, like a well-practiced oration. The officer, speaking for a higher authority that no one present fully trusted, explained in a tentative tone that a theft report had been filed and that protocol required a secondary search off board. When Charles pressed further, asking who had made the report, the answer was delivered with an air of smug finality: that it had been filed by the very woman in seat Ton C whose missing Cartier had triggered the chain of events. Even Rebecca, standing a few rows back with her arms folded as though to emphasize her silent approval, played her part in this theater of cruelty. "I think it's high time we made this the spectacle they want," Charles declared, his voice rising with a mix of righteous indignation and quiet defiance. "Let them see the truth. Let them witness the injustice for what it is." His invitation to scandal was laced with irony, a deliberate provocation designed to force the hand of those who had condemned him without evidence. When the officer instructed him to leave his carry-on behind for a more transparent search, Charles couldn't help but retort, "You mean for humiliation?" The question, simple yet laden with scorn, elicited no response from the officer, who instead gestured for a young, nervous flight attendant to open his bag in full view of the already captivated audience. As the zipper of his bag hissed open and his carefully packed belongings spilled forth, every item took on new significance. The neatly folded blazer, the sleek laptop, the binder marked confidential, and even the scattered personal documents all became artifacts of a life defined by meticulous order and quiet defiance against a world that rarely acknowledged his worth. But nothing was as heartbreaking as the child's drawing that tumbled out onto the floor. A humble stick figure sketch of him holding hands with a small girl, accompanied by a tender note that read, "Good luck, Daddy. You're the bravest man I know. Love, Jada." In that moment, the cruelty of the injustice was laid bare. Not only was he being wronged as a man, but a father was being forced to bear witness to the humiliation inflicted upon him, while his own child's innocence was exploited for spectacle. Even as the lead officer confirmed with a reluctant nod that nothing was amiss with his belongings, Charles remained defiant. "There was never anything to find," he said, his tone clipped with finality. His eyes, burning with quiet fury, met those of Rebecca, silently demanding an apology that would never come. Not then, and perhaps not ever. The standoff lingered, a silent battle of wills where every gaze held a challenge and every whispered comment was a tacit acknowledgement of the injustice at hand. As the officers allowed him to return to his seat, Charles did so with an air of determination that suggested this was merely the opening act of a much larger struggle, a struggle that would ultimately lead to a resounding act of retribution. Every step he took back to his row was measured, a silent promise that his story was far from over. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The passengers, once silent and complicit, now moved as if paying homage to a man who had dared to stand against a tide of prejudice. A simple nod from the young woman who had recorded earlier, averted eyes from a man in 3A, and a subtle shift in body language all spoke volumes of the solidarity that, though unspoken, was growing among the witnesses. Meanwhile, Rebecca did not return to her usual post by his row. Instead, she huddled with another attendant in the galley, her furtive glances towards Charles revealing an unease that contradicted the smug satisfaction she had projected earlier. For what seemed like an eternity, the plane remained suspended in a state of unresolved tension. The boarding delayed, the door left open, and every soul aboard acutely aware that they were part of an unfolding drama that challenged the very ideals of fairness and decency. The events of that flight were not just a personal attack on Charles Walker, but a microcosm of a larger, more systemic prejudice that had infiltrated every corner of society. His experience, a litany of indignities and barely concealed malice, resonated with anyone who had ever felt the sting of unearned judgment or the searing pain of being ostracized for who they were. And as the flight prepared to depart amidst the lingering silence, Charles's quiet determination promised that his response would not be measured in whispers or half-hearted apologies, but in a resounding call for justice that would echo far beyond the narrow confines of a first-class cabin. Now, in the days that followed, the story of that flight would capture the imagination and the indignation of countless individuals, especially those like the kind, perceptive women of 65 years and older who had seen too much injustice in their long lives to accept such cruelty without protest. They would recall that day as a turning point, a moment when a man who had been forced to endure shame and humiliation chose to rise above the indignities of prejudice and demand accountability in a way that no one could ignore. His actions, his measured calm in the face of unwarranted fury, and his insistence on transparency would serve as a rallying cry for justice, inspiring a movement that insisted on fairness, respect, and the recognition that every life, every story, deserves the dignity that society so often withholds from its most vulnerable citizens. Charles Walker's journey that day was not simply about reclaiming a stolen moment or proving his innocence to an indifferent crowd. It was about transforming a deeply personal experience of humiliation into a public declaration that injustice would no longer be tolerated. With every step he took, every word he spoke, and every calculated move, like that decisive call for legal intervention, he was staking a claim in a battle that was larger than any single flight. It was a fight against the systemic rot of discrimination, against the callous disregard for the dignity of those who had built their lives on resilience and hard work. And it was a fight that, for many watching that day, ignited a spark of hope. A spark that one day the scales would finally tip in favor of truth and justice. For those who had witnessed his ordeal, the memory of that flight was indelibly etched into their minds. They recalled how, despite being singled out on the basis of nothing more than the color of his skin, Charles Walker maintained a quiet, unyielding grace in the face of cruelty. They remembered the sharp, disdainful tone in Rebecca Summers's voice as she declared him guilty without evidence, and the cold efficiency with which the security officers executed their orders. But above all, they remembered the resolute look in his eyes when he dared to demand accountability, a look that spoke louder than any accusation, that declared with crystal clarity that he would not be broken by a system that was rigged against him. In the end, the flight became more than just an episode of humiliation and racial injustice. It became a symbol of the eternal struggle for dignity and respect in a world where prejudice often masquerades as order. And as the plane soared into the sky, propelled by engines that roared like the collective defiance of all those who had ever been mistreated, Charles Walker's quiet, fierce determination promised that what started as a moment of indignity would soon culminate in a retaliation so grand and so meticulously executed that it would leave onlookers in awe. His measured rebellion was destined to transform public opinion, to force even the most hardened skeptics to confront the harsh realities of racial discrimination, and to set in motion a series of events that would ultimately restore faith in the principles of justice and equality. For the kind of woman who has seen decades of change in this nation, who has sat in quiet rocking chairs and listened to stories of hardship and triumph, the narrative of that troubled flight resonated on a deeply personal level. It recalled the struggles of a bygone era when every act of defiance was a step toward a better future. A reminder that, even after 65 years of life, there is always room for hope, for righteousness, and for a dramatic vindication that proves, in the end, that justice, however delayed, will always prevail. Charles Walker's story was thus not merely a recounting of an incident on a flight, but a clarion call, a call for every person who has ever been marginalized, misunderstood, or unfairly targeted. It was a story of bitter conflict and raw emotion, of a man forced to endure unbearable humiliation who, instead of cowering in silence, chose to document every moment of his injustice with unwavering resolve. His response, when delivered with the quiet fortitude of a life lived in the shadow of discrimination, would soon become the talk of not just that flight, but of a nation long overdue for a reckoning with its own past. In the unfolding days, as news of the incident spread like wildfire and the tale of that extraordinary flight reached every corner of the country, from small-town diners in the Midwest to sophisticated salons in the bustling cities of the East Coast, people began to see the event as the spark for a movement that challenged the status quo, that dared to stand up to prejudice, and that promised to shake the very foundations of an old. And through it all, the image of Charles Walker, a man whose every feature conveyed the weariness of years spent struggling against invisible barriers, yet whose eyes burned with a defiant light, became emblematic of a new era, a time when the oppressed could no longer silently suffer their indignities, but would instead rise with a vengeance that was both long-awaited and magnificently executed. Thus, as the aircraft finally prepared for takeoff, with the lingering tension in the cabin transforming into an almost reverent silence, it was clear that this was not the end of Charles Walker's tale. No, this was only the beginning of a grand act of retribution. A public, meticulously documented, and awe-inspiring response that would force the crew and every onlooker to question the very nature of authority and justice. In that moment, as each passenger in first class became an unwilling witness to the mechanics of prejudice and the emergence of fierce resistance, Charles Walker's quiet, dignified stance promised that the future held more than just empty apologies and hollow reassurances. It held a reckoning that would echo across generations. And so, dear listener, as you sit back and reflect on this harrowing but ultimately uplifting account, remember that this is a story not of victimhood but of resilience. A narrative that reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when the weight of discrimination seems insurmountable, there is always a spark of hope. There is always the possibility for a response so bold, so resounding, that the oppressors are forced to answer for their cruelty, and the marginalized are given the chance to reclaim their dignity on their own terms. Charles Walker's journey on Flight 716 is a testament to that timeless truth. A truth that resonates with the wisdom of a lifetime and inspires us to stand up, speak out, and demand nothing less than justice. In the end, the flight was not just a vehicle for travel, but a stage upon which the drama of life was played out in all its complexity. It was a day when the carefully constructed facades of authority and order crumbled under the relentless pressure of truth. And as Charles Walker returned to his seat with a steadfast gaze and a heart full of determination, every soul on board was reminded that the fight against injustice is never over. It is a battle that must be fought every single day, in every corner of our lives, until the promise of equality is finally fulfilled. Charles Walker had just stepped off the plane into a scene that would forever change the dynamics of power, prejudice, and retribution aboard Flight 716. As he walked down the aisle toward the exit, a familiar voice from behind caught his attention. The same man from seat 3A, the smirking white-hailed executive who had earlier ridiculed him with a derisive comment, leaned forward with a mocking chuckle. "Guess all that class doesn't come with dignity, huh?" the man muttered under his breath, his tone oozing contempt. "First-class ticket and yet a third-class character." His words struck Charles like a forceful slap, not only cutting into his pride but also wounding the hearts of every silent observer in that tightly packed cabin who recognized the cruelty behind such elitist commentary. A young woman who had earlier attempted to record the incident on her phone clenched her fists tightly, as if to hold back the surge of indignation building within her. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was thick with tension and the murmur of discontent. The flight attendant who had been handling the briefcase and the scattered papers froze for a split second before hastily gathering them. Charles, undeterred by the humiliation he had just suffered, bent down slowly and retrieved the small crayon note that had fallen from his belongings. With deliberate care, he brushed off a scuff mark that had appeared in the interim, a physical reminder of the rough treatment he had received. And as he rose to his feet, his countenance changed dramatically. His eyes, once filled with quiet resilience, now glinted with a chilling determination. It was as if something deep inside him had shifted gears, transforming his hurt into a steely resolve. He locked eyes with Rebecca, the flight attendant whose cold efficiency had been the instrument of his public disgrace, and in a voice that carried both sorrow and ire, he declared, "This is the last time I fly silent. You have just filed your resignation letter." Rebecca's reaction was measured, yet betraying the slightest indication of doubt. For a moment she did not flinch. Instead, she blinked once, then twice, as if the magnitude of his words had forced her to confront the gravity of her actions. In the background, an officer standing near Charles cleared his throat, muttering, "We're wasting time." As if his words could somehow speed up the inevitable unraveling of the situation. Nevertheless, with a single, resolute nod, Charles followed the officer toward the exit. As he passed by rows of passengers, the whispers quickly escalated into a cacophony of murmurs. Some passengers spoke under their breath, their words tinted with pity for the wronged man, while others, with a hint of voyeuristic satisfaction, relished every moment of his public humiliation. One man even muttered, "This is why we need stricter screenings," as if the systemic prejudice and injustice could be somehow justified by bureaucratic measures. A woman clutching her purse a little tighter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but not everyone turned away in disgust. Among the onlookers was a gentleman from row 5, a sharply dressed man in a suit with a press badge clipped neatly to his lapel, who activated his phone camera openly rather than covertly recording the event. His intent was to document every moment of this unfolding controversy. As Charles stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge, the overhead lights flickered momentarily, a brief glitch in the system that seemed, symbolically, to mirror the faltering facade of order and decorum in that first-class cabin. In the midst of all this commotion, Rebecca stood transfixed, her gaze fixed on the empty space where Charles had just been, a look that conveyed both disbelief and the dawning realization that she might have sown the seeds of her own professional and moral undoing. Inside the cabin, the young attendant who had earlier handled the bag lingered behind. With gentle care, she picked up the crayon note that Charles had dropped and secured it in the front pocket of his bag before closing it with more attention than she had shown before. The passengers, now more aware than ever of the gravity of the situation, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, the weight of what had transpired hung heavily in the air. This was no longer about mere protocol or routine suspicion. It was about something far more profound. A transformation in perception from being an object of humiliation to becoming the architect of a counterstrike against systemic injustice. Back in the first-class cabin, the tone had shifted abruptly. What had once been a scene of calm indulgence had turned tense, conflicted, and self-consciously aware of its own silence. In a row just behind the now vacant seat of Charles Walker, a man named Daniel Tran, a quiet but observant passenger with neatly adjusted glasses, leaned forward in his seat. Daniel was not outspoken or confrontational by nature, yet he had noticed details that no one else had either grasped or been brave enough to mention. Just minutes before the missing watch had been reported and the ensuing hysteria had begun, Daniel recalled seeing Grace, one of the junior flight attendants, briskly walking toward the galley. In her hand, she held what unmistakably looked like a rose-gold Cartier watch, its gleam betraying the possibility that it was the very watch later claimed to have gone missing. At the time, Daniel had dismissed it as a simple case of lost and found, a common enough occurrence among the sea of passengers. However, as the accusations focused squarely on Charles Walker and the events began to unfold with a cold, calculated precision, Daniel's memory churned, growing restless and insistent. Glancing toward the galley where Grace now stood with her shoulders drawn tight and arms wrapped protectively around her torso, Daniel's curiosity could no longer be contained. He mustered his courage, rose from his seat, and walked toward the entrance of the galley, careful not to provoke undue alarm among the crew. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice a gentle interruption in the tense atmosphere. Grace spun around, startled by his unexpected approach. Her eyes widened in surprise, not because she recognized him, but because here was a fellow passenger who was not a member of the crew, someone who had managed to come uncomfortably close to the inner sanctum of operations. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, trying to steady her voice against the rising tide of uncertainty. Daniel lowered his tone further, adding, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but earlier, before all of this began, I saw you holding a watch. A rose-gold Cartier, wasn't it?" Grace's neutral smile faltered instantly, her carefully rehearsed composure crumbling for a brief moment. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Sensing her inner turmoil, Daniel pressed gently, "I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want to know the truth." Casting furtive glances around to ensure that Rebecca was not within earshot, Grace's expression grew pained. After a long, trembling moment, she nodded once, her voice now a mere whisper, "Yes." Daniel leaned in a little closer, his tone gentle yet insistent as he continued, "Was that the same watch that was reported missing?" Grace's eyes dropped to the floor, and in a voice barely audible, she admitted, "It was never lost." Her confession, laden with despair and regret, confirmed Daniel's suspicions. She explained that the watch had not been misplaced in a moment of forgetfulness, but had been deliberately left behind by the passenger in seat 2C, who had turned it in before boarding. The implications of her words rippled through the confined space of the cabin, resonating with every passenger who had silently endured the injustice inflicted upon Charles Walker. With a shaky breath, Grace added that she had a premonition that something was amiss, that the decision to file the report against Charles was not born out of caution, but rather from an unspoken, sinister agenda. Daniel's eyes closed for a moment, absorbing the weight of her revelation before she continued. She had been pressured by senior crew members, and her own moral compass had been at war with the directive she had been forced to follow. "I didn't agree with it," she whispered, her voice tinged with both sorrow and anger. "But the senior crew insisted it was better to err on the side of caution." Daniel's soft reiteration of the word caution carried a bitter irony as he murmured, "That wasn't caution. That was character assassination." Grace, Her eyes glistening with unshed tears did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned abruptly and walked toward the back of the galley, her exit as swift as it was silent. Before Rebecca could intervene, Daniel remained standing there, processing the disturbing truth that had been laid bare before him, and then he slowly made his way back to his seat. Not before he stole a glance at the overhead camera, nestled discreetly between the lights above row 2. With a decisive tap on his phone, he opened his email and began typing a detailed message with the subject line reading, "Formal, passenger, observation flight 710. 16. In that message, he meticulously documented the timestamps, the sequence of events he had witnessed, and the names of both Grace and Rebecca, hoping that this testimony would serve as a powerful piece of evidence against the prejudicial treatment that had unfolded so brazenly. Meanwhile, back in the forward cabin, Rebecca had resumed her post, her posture now once again exuding a veneer of unyielding confidence as she spoke quietly to the woman in seat 2C. Security handled it professionally, she insisted, her tone dismissive of any implication that her earlier actions had been an error. Even as she repeated this line, a sinister irony lingered in the air. Every word she uttered, every gesture and every subtle shift in her body language was being recorded by the airline's internal audio system. Standard procedure on flights of this caliber dictated that every interaction among the crew should be captured for later review, and Charles Walker was acutely aware of that fact. Standing just beyond the boarding bridge, still bathed in the glow of the airplane's exit lights, he observed the unfolding drama with a mix of grim satisfaction and steely resolve. Inside his mind, every detail, the look on Rebecca's face, the way she zeroed in on him with deliberate malice, the fleeting lapse of empathy in the young attendant's eyes, and even the understated defiance displayed by the passenger who had recorded the episode, clicked into place like pieces of a meticulously arranged puzzle. They had made a crucial mistake. Charles had always known that perception, when twisted by prejudice, could quickly morph into a tool of prosecution. What Rebecca and her cohorts had failed to understand was that he had entered this battlefield not as an isolated victim, but with a network of allies, both seen and unseen, ready to back his fight for justice. Even as one of the security officers dismissed himself with a stiff nod, Charles wasted no time. He retrieved his phone once more, tapping a secured application that only a man of his stature and connections could access. After a swift biometric scan, a screen populated with a top-tier contact list appeared. Without hesitation, he selected a line marked as the Anderson Group Legal Chairman line, a direct line to one of the most influential litigation firms in the country, known for its reputation of taking down corporations and forcing airlines into record settlements over breaches of conduct and discrimination lawsuits. Bringing the phone to his ear with calm finality, Charles spoke in a low, measured tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "This is Walker. I'm in play." His words were deliberate, each syllable resonating with the weight of years spent fighting against a system that had long taken advantage of the vulnerable. Flight 776, Civil Procedure Escalation Protocol. Activate all privacy waivers. Flag this incident with the Department of Transportation and Internal Counsel. I want all recorded cabin data pulled the moment we land. Video, audio, flight crew logs, everything. And prepare the holding complaint for prejudicial conduct. We will be naming names. His words trailed off into a determined silence, punctuated only by the firm tap of his fingers on the table. Then, after a brief pause, he ended the call without waiting for any acknowledgement. Locking his phone securely, he turned slowly and walked purposefully back into the aircraft. Behind him, the security officer momentarily hesitated and then looked away, clearly aware that this confrontation was not the rambling threat of an angry passenger, but the calculated move of a man with deep connections and uncompromising resolve. Charles re-entered first class like a seasoned chess master returning to the board after a well-calculated break. fully aware of every shift and every subtle move in the unfolding drama. Almost immediately, the murmurs resumed in full force. Some passengers lowered their eyes in submission or fear. Others glanced away in self-preservation, while a select few, like Daniel, watched with an intensity born of newfound respect. But none could match the unwavering scrutiny of Rebecca, who now stood near the galley, her posture a mix of rigid authority and simmering anxiety. As Charles passed her, he made no attempt to speak. He didn't need to. His actions, each deliberate and measured, had already declared his intentions unequivocally. He had started something far more damning than a simple verbal confrontation. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, the very slightest miscalculation on her part had set off a chain reaction that threatened to expose the deep-seated biases and systemic failings of the crew. In a moment of misplaced confidence, she turned to her fellow attendant and whispered with a dismissive smirk, "What's he gonna do? Call his TikTok lawyer? Please." Her tone, dripping with a careless arrogance, belied the fear that was beginning to grip those who had witnessed the events firsthand. A junior attendant chuckled nervously, but a few feet behind, Grace caught a glimpse of the dark reflection on Charles's phone screen just as it dimmed. A glimpse that spoke volumes. The name Anderson Group Legal, long recognized as the legal muscle behind several Fortune 100 companies and infamous for its aggressive litigation tactics, flashed briefly across the screen. Grace's breath caught in her throat. In that single, fleeting moment, she realized that Charles Walker was not merely an ordinary businessman forced into an impossible situation. He was a man with weighty connections, a man who commanded influence through his association with one of the most formidable legal firms in the nation. Charles returned to his seat and, with quiet resolve, collected the remaining personal items scattered about, including the cherished drawing from his daughter Jada, now placed with utmost care on top of the rest. Sitting down with the calm of a man who had weathered enough storms to know the value of every precious moment, he immediately resumed logging the details of the day's events. His fingers flew over his phone's keyboard as he opened a folder labeled CR-19 Flight Protocols and began meticulously recording timestamps, the expressions etched on the faces of crew members, and even specific quotes that had been uttered in a tone heavy with derision and prejudice. Meanwhile, in the shadowed recesses of the crew area, Grace, her conscience aflame with guilt, approached Rebecca with a hesitant urgency. "We need to talk," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. Rebecca raised an eyebrow, a subtle sign of contempt mingled with curiosity. "What is it?" she asked flatly. "That man," Grace began, her voice dropping to a near inaudible murmur. "He just called Anderson Group Legal." The words hung in the air like a death knell, their implications far graver than any idle threat. "You know what that means, right?" Grace pressed, unable to mask the tremor in her voice. Rebecca, rolling her eyes as though dismissing a trivial matter, sneered, "It means he knows someone who knows someone. We see it all the time. Empty threats. He'll calm down after a drink and a free voucher." But Grace, knowing deep in her heart that something was irrevocably different this time, replied with quiet conviction, "I don't believe it anymore. This isn't just talk. You need to tell the captain what's going on." Rebecca scoffed, her tone icy with derision. "Tell the captain what? That I asked a man to show his ticket and he got upset? That I followed up on a theft report? I followed policy." The words fell like a heavy weight in the charged atmosphere of the cabin. "You went after him based on nothing, and if legal gets involved, it's not going to stop with you," Grace snapped, before lowering her voice as another passenger hurried past them. Rebecca's jaw tightened visibly, but she said nothing more, instead turning away and reaching for her tablet, with hands that now betrayed a shaking uncertainty. At the same time, Daniel Tran, still reeling from his earlier discovery, tapped out another email on his phone. This time he made sure to include a carbon copy to his firm's internal equity committee, determined that every piece of evidence would be scrutinized. Nearby, the man from seat 3A, the same white-hailed executive who had mocked Charles earlier, remained motionless, pretending to read a newspaper, though his eyes betrayed an unspoken awareness of the monumental shift in events. The atmosphere in first class had transformed once again. Gone was the transient pity and smug superiority. In its place was a charged ambiance of anticipation and dread. Rebecca stood near the galley, gripping her tablet a bit too tightly, stealing furtive glances at Charles, yet refusing outright to meet his unwavering gaze. Grace remained a few steps behind, biting the inside of her cheek as she glanced nervously between passengers, aware that every second could be the moment the situation would explode into irreversible consequence. Then came a moment that crystallized the shifting power dynamics in the cabin. As Charles re-entered the aircraft with that quiet, formidable purpose, he passed by Rebecca without so much as a glance. A silent but clear message that he had already taken decisive steps. Unbeknownst to her, this was not mere bravado. It was the launching of a counteroffensive that would leave her and her cohorts scrambling to salvage their reputations. In the hushed, heavy silence that followed his re-entry, Rebecca leaned over to a fellow attendant and whispered with a hint of derision, "What's he gonna do next? Call his TikTok lawyer? Please." The remark, meant to belittle his actions, instead hung in the air as a testament to her underestimation of his resolve. A junior attendant chuckled nervously at the absurdity of the comment, but the brief, almost unnoticed reaction from Grace told a different story. For a fraction of a second, Grace's eyes widened in realization as she caught sight of the confirmation on Charles's phone screen. Anderson Group Legal. It was the kind of name that sent tremors through boardrooms and made headlines in national news, a name that signified serious legal muscle and an unyielding resolve to set things right. Charles, now seated once more, gathered his scattered belongings with a dignified air that only added to his aura of quiet yet unbreakable strength. He tenderly placed Jada's drawing, an emblem of innocent hope and the tender bonds of family, on top of his other personal items, as if safeguarding a precious relic amidst the chaos of injustice. Then, with a deep breath that seemed to draw from decades of resilience and defiance, he resumed his documentation of the unfolding events. Every detail was being logged meticulously, each timestamp added with precision. His eyes, though tired from a lifetime of battles against systemic injustice, burned with the fire of retribution. He knew that what had begun as a humiliating ordeal was about to ignite into a full-fledged campaign for justice. A campaign that would expose every hidden prejudice, every callous disregard for human dignity, and every malicious action taken by those who thought themselves untouchable. Outside the realm of the immediate chaos, the internal mechanisms of the flight continued their ceaseless operation. The overhead cameras, silently recording every nuance, were soon to be downloaded as incontrovertible evidence. The internal audio logs would bear witness to every whispered threat, every derisive laugh, and every feeble attempt by the crew to downplay the significance of what had transpired. In a world where appearances were carefully maintained and justice was often delayed, Charles Walker was rewriting the narrative. No longer would he be a silent victim. He was now the orchestrator of a counter-strike that was as cleverly executed as it was morally righteous. As the flight slowly taxied toward the runway, the murmur of whispers gave way to a subdued tension that seemed to blanket every inch of the cabin. Some passengers cast sympathetic glances toward Charles, their eyes filled with empathy and a shared understanding of the injustice they had witnessed. Others, too frightened or complicit to speak, simply stared into their laps, their expressions marked by the realization that the veneer of civility had been irreparably shattered. Rebecca, for her part, appeared trapped in a moment of inner conflict. Her eyes, once hard and impervious, now flickered with uncertainty every time they met the steely gaze of Charles Walker. Even if only in passing, a part of her perhaps recognized that what she had done was more than a simple misapplication of protocol. It was an act of cruelty born out of a prejudice that had long festered in the shadows of her soul. The culmination of all these moments was far from over. Charles's calculated act of logging each detail, his discreet yet resolute call to Anderson Group Legal, and his quiet, unyielding defiance had set in motion a process that would expose the ugly truth of systematic discrimination. In the coming hours, as the plane soared into the American skies with its engines humming steadily, every recorded piece of data would become a weapon in a legal and moral battle that promised to shake the very foundations of the airline industry. Legal briefs would be drafted, internal investigations would be launched, and the public, especially those wise and discerning women who had witnessed decades of both triumph and sorrow, would watch in awe as the oppressors were finally forced to reckon with the consequences of their actions. Charles Walker's journey was evolving into something far greater than a personal battle. It had transformed into a clarion call, a rallying cry for every individual who had ever been humiliated or marginalized by a system that regarded them as less than human. His quiet resolve, his methodical documentation of every slight and insult, and his willingness to challenge authority head-on were acts of defiance that resonated deeply with those who had been treated unjustly throughout their lives. For the seasoned audience of American women, many of whom had endured the hardships and victories of a long and storied life, this was more than a story. It was a mirror reflecting every injustice they had ever fought against, every burden they had borne in silence, and every time they had dreamt of a day when dignity and respect would be restored. As the plane finally lined up on the runway, ready for takeoff, the tension in the cabin reached its zenith. Every passenger, crew member, and even the security officer who had once seemed detached was now acutely aware that they were part of a narrative that transcended the confines of a mere flight. This was a story about the clash between entrenched authority and the irrepressible spirit of a man who had long been underestimated. It was a story of retribution, a retribution so meticulously planned and so forcefully executed that it would force the entire industry to confront the reality of its prejudices. With one last steady glance around the cabin, Charles Walker knew that no matter how many obstacles lay ahead, he had already turned the tide. The airplane, now more than a mode of transport, had become a stage upon which the drama of justice was being enacted. In that charged final moment before takeoff, Charles's mind was not clouded by fear or resignation. Instead, it was filled with the clarity of purpose that comes from a lifetime of enduring hardship. The evidence he had amassed, the allies he had silently gathered among the passengers, and the cold, hard resolve that now emanated from every fiber of his being were all testimonies to his unwavering commitment to set things right. Rebecca's smug satisfaction was already crumbling under the weight of undeniable proof. The recordings, the emails, the documented testimonies, all of these would later serve as the foundation of a legal crusade that promised not only to redress the wrongs inflicted on Charles, but to dismantle the very structure of prejudice that had allowed such an injustice to occur on a modern American flight. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, the collective heartbeat of every passenger seemed to synchronize with the roar of the engines. Each thump and rumble was a reminder that this was not just a flight. It was a turning point in the struggle for civil rights, dignity, and true justice. For every woman who had spent decades witnessing both the suffering and the resilience of human souls, this was a moment of catharsis. Here was a man who had been reduced to a symbol of racial injustice, and now he was poised to transform that symbol into an unstoppable force for change. In that final, breathtaking instant before the plane soared into the vast expanse of the American sky, hope and retribution melded into one, as Charles Walker's quiet defiance promised that the reckoning was only just beginning. Every detail of that flight, from the mocking laughter of the white-hailed executive in 3A to the whispered confessions of a conflicted junior attendant, would soon be scrutinized by a public that had grown weary of empty platitudes and cowardly excuses. The injustice meted out to Charles Walker, meticulously documented through every lens and recorded by every hidden camera, was destined to ignite a firestorm of accountability. As the plane climbed higher, powered by engines that echoed with the spirit of American resilience, Charles's actions transformed a personal act of indignation into a movement that challenged the very essence of systemic discrimination. For the audience, mature women who had seen the promise and the failures of this nation, a tale like this was both heartbreaking and redemptive. It reminded them of the long, arduous journey toward equality, of the sacrifices made along the way, and of the enduring possibility for a future in which every human being was treated with the respect and dignity they rightfully deserved. And as the aircraft soared over vast American landscapes measured in miles and watched over by skies as infinite as hope itself, Charles Walker's quiet, decisive steps toward retribution stood as a beacon of unwavering courage. In the ensuing days that would follow this fateful flight, the repercussions of what had happened aboard Flight 716 would echo far and wide. Legal action, media scrutiny, and public outcry were sure to follow, each step a response to the stark injustice that had unfolded before the eyes of so many. But more than that, it would be remembered as a turning point, a dramatic confrontation between a man determined to reclaim his dignity and a system that had long sought to silence him. The legacy of Charles Walker's stand would be recounted in countless stories, resonating with those who understood that every act of defiance in the face of prejudice was a victory for justice. And so, as the plane continued its journey into the horizon, with passengers settling into an uneasy calm that belied the storm of change brewing beneath, one truth remained indisputable. The age of silent submission was over. Charles Walker had taken his rightful place as not merely a victim of unjust treatment, but as a man of action who would not allow systemic discrimination to go unchecked. His story, recorded in every whispered conversation and every captured moment of defiant courage, would soon herald a new era of accountability and, ultimately, retribution so magnificent that it would leave onlookers in a state of awe and, perhaps, even a hint of admiration. For those who had borne witness, especially the wise, seasoned women who had weathered decades of hardship and triumph alike, this was not merely a saga of personal vindication. It was a testament to the enduring human spirit. It affirmed that no matter how deep the scars of injustice, there lay within each of us the capacity to rise up, to challenge the oppressive forces that sought to diminish us, and to restore balance where inequality had long reigned unchecked. Charles Walker's fateful day on Flight 716 was a reminder that every act of cruelty, every act of racism, when confronted with unwavering resolve and strategic brilliance, could be transformed into a catalyst for sweeping change. In the grand tapestry of life, moments like these become turning points that define generations. The story of Charles Walker, emerging triumphant from an episode designed to debase him, would forever be etched into the annals of history as a rallying cry, a declaration that the forces of prejudice and cruelty would one day be vanquished by the light of truth and justice. And for every mature soul who had dedicated years to the pursuit of dignity and equity, his battle was a beacon, a gentle yet forceful reminder that the fight for what is right never truly ends until every wrong is set right. As Flight 776 continued its journey, cutting through American skies measured in miles and driven by engines humming with steady power, the legacy of that day was already in motion. A legacy built not on humiliation, but on the promise of retribution. Not on subservience, but on the bold assertion that every injustice, no matter how carefully cloaked in the garb of order, could be dismantled by truth, courage, and the collective will of those who refuse to be oppressed. For Charles Walker, and for every voice that had once been stifled by the heavy hand of discrimination, the future was bright with the prospect of justice. Thus, as the final moments before takeoff slipped away, the truth was clear. The narrative on Flight 716 was no longer one of silence and submission. It had become a resounding call for action. The meticulous documentation, the quiet yet unyielding defiance, and the united resolve of those who had witnessed the injustice were all elements in a masterstroke of resistance. In that moment, as the aircraft lifted off the runway and soared into the boundless American sky, every passenger on board bore silent witness to a new chapter in the fight for equality, a chapter that promised to reverberate far beyond the confines of that single flight and to ignite a transformation so dramatic that even the most cynical hearts would be compelled to acknowledge that justice, however delayed, was indeed inevitable. Charles Walker sat still with his arms folded, staring out the window as his phone rested in his lap. The discreet, legally configured app was recording audio under his firm's strict internal documentation protocol, a silent witness to every injustice unfolding around him. Then something unexpected happened that no one anticipated. After boarding was complete, the cockpit door opened. In stepped Captain Ray Delaney, a seasoned pilot known for his calm under pressure even during emergency landings, his usually unshakable demeanor now visibly disturbed. Following closely behind him was a young operations officer in an airport badge vest, his face flushed and his breath coming in short, nervous bursts as he leaned in to whisper confidential words into the captain's ear. Only fragments of the whispered conversation reached the passengers in the front, but those fragments carried the weight of legal and corporate authority as direct orders echoed through the cabin. The captain's eyes narrowed slowly as he turned his head toward Charles Walker, his expression a mix of confusion and dawning recognition. That one dropped name carried significance, a secret code that now forced him to act. Captain Delaney straightened his posture and, with a short nod to the operations officer, he approached Rebecca Summers with an air of calm authority. "Summers, may I speak to you for a moment?" he said in a measured tone that left no room for argument. Rebecca's composure wavered as she blinked, her face betraying uncertainty as the captain's firm tone left her little choice but to comply. He pulled her aside near the front cabin wall and spoke in low, deliberate tones that barely carried over the hushed whispers of nearby passengers who had instinctively leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Race, the junior attendant whose earlier actions had painted her as both complicit and conflicted, stood frozen in her place, too afraid to make a single movement. Rebecca's face turned ashen as she listened to Captain Delaney, trying to muster a response before being cut off by a subtle shake of his head. With that, he stepped past her and walked directly toward Charles Walker, clearing his throat in a respectful manner that nonetheless carried an undercurrent of authority. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "I have been informed that your presence on this flight carries additional significance. On behalf of the airline, allow me to personally apologize for any inconvenience or disrespect you have encountered." Charles remained seated, his posture dignified and his gaze unwavering as he met the captain's words without a hint of a smile. "I appreciate that, Captain, but apologies mean nothing without follow-through," he replied evenly. Delaney nodded once, as if acknowledging a mutual understanding before instructing him, "Please make yourself comfortable. We are working to address the situation immediately." As the captain returned to the cockpit, passengers began to whisper more openly. A woman from seat Ton B turned to her husband, asking quietly, "What is going on?" While her husband, wide-eyed and uncertain, merely shrugged in response. In the aisle, Grace exhaled slowly for the first time in nearly 10 minutes, as if releasing pent-up anxiety. The true turning point came when the aircraft door reopened, a dramatic, highly unusual event for a flight that had already pushed back from the gate. Gasps fluttered through the cabin, and every eye turned as a tall man in a tailored Navy suit stepped on board. He carried a slim leather folder and sported a Skylux Airlines lapel pin, his face pale and his steps purposeful. This man was not a member of the standard crew. He was the airline's director of communications, Brendan Ellis, whose presence was reserved only for damage control in moments of crisis. Without pausing for introductions, Brendan's eyes swept the cabin until they landed on Charles Walker, and for a brief, charged moment, his expression widened before he regained his professional composure. He leaned toward the lead flight attendant, now standing rigidly at his post, and whispered something urgent. Rebecca's face, already pale from the unfolding drama, flushed a deep beet red, as if the pressure of the moment had overloaded her. Brendan hissed sharply into the ear of a nearby crew member, his tone low yet loaded with contempt. "You did not know who he was? You initiated an accusation on a verified shareholder?" His words, audible just enough for Grace to catch them, pierced the already tense air. Grace closed her eyes in disbelief as Charles Walker remained seated, unmoving, and letting the chaos around him build as if he were watching the unraveling of a carefully constructed play. Brendan tried to offer Charles Walker a reassuring smile as he approached him. "Mr. Walker, we are aware that this situation has escalated far beyond what it should have," he said, his voice measured and professional. "Corporate has authorized me to remain on board through takeoff to ensure that any and all concerns are addressed appropriately." Charles looked at Brendan without coldness, but with a clear, unmistakable expectation. His reply was quiet, yet bristled with underlying power. "You are one mistake too late," he said. With those words, he sent a message that no further deviation from the truth would be tolerated. "I will be needing a printout of employee conduct logs from the last 2 months, along with an updated incident report for today's flight, submitted to oversight within 24 hours. Brendan nodded immediately in recognition of the gravity of the situation. "Yes, sir, I will handle it personally." Charles corrected him succinctly. "Not personally, it is official. This is not a PR mess, it is an overdue audit." In the background, Rebecca, listening while trying to maintain her facade of control, attempted a hesitant interjection. "Mr. Walker, I wasn't aware," she started, but before she could continue, Charles interjected without looking at her. "You were not aware. You acted based on instinct, assumption, and unchecked bias. That is why I am here, and that is why this is bigger than just me. It is about every single passenger who boards your flight, expecting to be treated with dignity." Rebecca froze, her lips parting slightly as the weight of his words sank in. Across the cabin, Grace and Brendan exchanged looks of grim resignation, while passengers huddled silently, sensing that they were witnessing a moment of historic reckoning. Near the front of the cabin, the overhead screens flickered to life as Brendan issued a command through his secured comms device to access internal surveillance data. Within moments, the seatback screens in first class began displaying live footage from the forward cabin and galley. Passengers watched in stunned silence as recordings played that captured every damning snippet of conversation. Rebecca's voice rang out in the recording as she insisted, "I do not care if he has a ticket. He is not the kind of guy that sits here," followed by footage of her standing near the galley, her demeanor disdainful as she questioned Charles Walker's every move. Then came a clip of her in the crew area whispering something to Grace, a call to stall any challenge from Charles, to make the accusation appear official, even if there was no evidence. The raw, unfiltered footage left no doubt in anyone's mind that her actions were not just misguided, but deliberately cruel. The room fell into a suffocating silence that was more explosive than any outcry. Brendan stepped forward, his face as white as chalk, preparing to address the assembled passengers, but Charles raised his hand before he could speak further. Turning slowly toward the cabin, Charles Walker addressed everyone with calm finality. "What you have just seen is not new," he began, his voice steady and carrying with it the authority of hard-won truth. "It did not start with me, and it does not end with her. But today it changes." His eyes swept over the audience, mature, discerning individuals who had seen decades of both hardship and triumph, and every word resonated like a verdict in a court of public opinion. "I've been gathering data for over 6 months, complaints, incident trends, anonymous surveys from staff. I needed one live, observable moment to finalize the case, and you provided it effortlessly. Every unprovoked accusation, every act of unchecked prejudice against me was recorded, and now it will be addressed not just legally, but as a matter of public record." As he spoke, Rebecca's face turned even paler. her earlier arrogance drained away, replaced by the realization that her actions would have consequences far beyond a mere reprimand. Charles slid his heavy metallic business ID back into his slim, dark leather wallet and returned to his seat with the quiet precision of a man who had already won the battle. His final act for the day was to open his phone once more and compose an internal message to the oversight board, a message that would soon seal the fate of those who had perpetrated this injustice. The tone of his words was resolute and unyielding, carrying a promise of retribution that left no room for doubt. In that charged moment, the first-class cabin had transformed into a courtroom where every whispered word, every shared glance, and every recorded second stood as evidence against systemic prejudice and unchecked cruelty. Charles Walker's actions were not a personal vendetta, but a clarion call for accountability, a message that even those entrenched in discriminatory practices could no longer hide behind policies and empty apologies. For every mature soul who had witnessed injustice in their long lives, this was a moment of catharsis, proof that when the oppressed stand tall and demand justice, the truth cannot be denied. As the aircraft rumbled toward takeoff with engines roaring steadily, the legacy of this flight was already being written. A legacy where every act of defiance against racial discrimination and mistreatment would be remembered as a victory for dignity and justice, leaving onlookers in awe of the power of truth. Charles Walker rose to address the stunned cabin with quiet yet unyielding conviction. Every face turned toward him as he spoke, his voice steady and clear. "I came here today not just as a passenger, not just as an investor, but as an observer," he began. "For months, we have received complaints, small things, quiet things, things easily ignored unless you have lived them. Profiling, selective courtesy, and blatant discriminatory practices are not isolated acts. They are symptoms of a deeply rooted culture that belittles human dignity." His words fell like heavy truths, and the murmurs subsided into an expectant silence. With every word, Charles exposed a pattern of abuse that no one on that flight could deny. "As of this moment," he declared, "I am submitting a formal recommendation to remove any staff whose conduct violates our equity code." His gaze fixed on Rebecca Summers, who stood near the galley, trembling as if her entire world was unraveling. "The recommendation begins with you, Rebecca, and we will launch a full investigation into training protocols, response mechanisms, and accountability frameworks." Her face, once confident, drained of color. Her hands gripped the handle of a drawer as if clinging to the remnants of her authority. "No passenger, black, brown, young or old, should ever have to defend their right to occupy a seat on a flight they have paid for," Charles continued. He turned to Brendan Ellis, the Director of Communications, and announced, "Public acknowledgement of this incident will be handled by corporate within 24 hours. I demand a recorded apology issued not only to me, but to every passenger who witnessed this bias in action." Brendan's throat worked as he swallowed dryly. Charles then leveled his next statement with quiet finality. "The board will back every word. I have been gathering data for months, incident trends, anonymous surveys, complaints, and today's events have sealed the case." The silence that followed was loaded with recognition. The smirking man in 3A, who once mocked his very presence, now sat like a remorseful schoolboy with eyes downcast. Rebecca's posture crumbled further as she stood rooted to the floor, her dignity shattering with every sentence. Grace, tears threatening to spill, whispered a sincere thank you as Charles passed her. That moment of gratitude reinforced that his stand was for every traveler who had been marginalized. Brendan Ellis then stepped forward with a sealed envelope, his hands unsteady. "Mr. Walker, per corporate legal and equity protocols, this envelope contains our formal acknowledgement of the incident and a compensation offer of $750,000, 0 cents, for both reputational and procedural damages." Charles took the envelope calmly and then looked directly into Brendan's eyes. Send it to the Freedom to Move Foundation. Every penny. I did not come here for a check. I came for change. As the announcement over the intercom declared that the flight was preparing to taxi, Captain Delaney reiterated the new policies. The cabin, once a venue for unchecked prejudice, had transformed into a courtroom of accountability. Within minutes, Rebecca Summers was escorted off the aircraft under direct order. Her employment terminated immediately under executive directive. No cheers followed her departure, only a heavy collective acknowledgement that true justice had finally arrived. Charles Walker closed his address, his voice gentle yet resolute. I did this not for applause, but for every Charles out there, for every traveler who deserves dignity. Today we rewrite the narrative. A soft round of respectful clapping and murmurs of approval swept across the cabin. Outside, as the aircraft taxied down the runway, a new chapter in the fight against discrimination had begun. The moment marked a turning point, a moment of reckoning that resonated deeply with every witness.